It looks okay. It's not great, it's not bad either. I mean, I've seen worse games before. It's probably the textbook definition of fine. I really do want to be proven wrong, and if they can do it, hey, I'll eat my own words. Chances are I might check it out, but the likelihood of that happening is like maybe 25%-ish, who knows. Well, it's time to start putting my money where my mouth is. I played Tower of Fantasy for 18 hours. I created 2 characters on different servers. I played through most of the story, and I attempted to explore most of what the game had to offer at the time. By this point, I believe I'm ready to talk about my experience with Tower of Fantasy for a bit. Unlike my previous reviews and impressions, this video will be a little more generalized. I might be skipping out on several features like raids, but know that this video will be as fair as possible. Before we get started, I understand that it would be nearly impossible to talk about Tower of Fantasy and not mention the elephant in the room in the form of Genshin Impact. However, in my last Tower of Fantasy video, I made said comparison and I was lambasted for it. I won't say that it wasn't justified as certain comparisons should have been elaborated better, but to say that Tower of Fantasy isn't free of criticism is disingenuous. For this first impressions video, I'm going to split this into 2 parts. The first half will focus on Tower of Fantasy on its own. No Genshin Impact, but there will be smaller mentions of other games to illustrate a point. The second half will consist of comparisons that mostly revolve around Genshin Impact, as Tower of Fantasy does contain elements that's inspired by the former. So, with that said, let's go and launch the game and delve into the world of Tower of Fantasy. Huh? Crash? No. That's gotta be a fluke, right? Come on, here. Let me just try that again. So that's how it's gonna be, huh? Yeah, within the first few days, I wasn't able to get past the game launcher. Even when I managed to get the game working properly, every time I exit the game, my PC blue screened as if to say, okay, you're done for the day, no more computer. The mobile version of Tower of Fantasy, based on my experience, is issue-free. 0 problems on iPhone. The PC version on a technical level is the one I have major issues with. There's the aforementioned crashes, but there are some peculiar oddities like going below the ground. I've had this happen several times, and I'm not certain this ever got fixed. Then there's server issues in the beginning. I'm certain this got alleviated by this point, so congestion isn't too much of an issue anymore. And character voices were either cut off early or were just missing from the game.
Hello, Hannah. My name is Mia. We are here to see Dr. Claire regarding important issues.
Big fellow, mighty, big fellow, can help.
Regardless of how I felt about Tower of Fantasy after the fact, this wasn't a good first impression. Wait. Maybe I got off on the wrong foot. How about once I start playing the game? Is the game good then? It's good. It's nothing great. It's not going to light the world on fire or anything like that. I just think that Tower of Fantasy is a good game. Although there are a few things that I want to point out. We should talk some positives first before getting into the negatives. The main character you play as is a fully voiced, customizable avatar. I will fully admit, I've only played a handful of MMOs in my life. The last one I remember playing extensively was Terra, before the switch between developers. In that game, the character was mute, save for the occasional grunt or oof. In Tower of Fantasy, the main character, male or female, is fully voiced during cutscenes.
Hey, I'm a friend of Shirley's. She sent me to get help from you.
Has Shirley been in trouble?
She's alright. We're just trying to fix a broken deconstructor, and we're hoping to borrow your backup power source.
Understood. Take the backup power supply.
What's more is the player can create their own character after a certain point in the game. The customization is not to the level of detail and manipulation like Code Vein, but it's good enough to let the creative juices flow. In terms of gameplay, exploration and traversal methods are one of the highlights. Throughout the game, players will unlock tools such as jetpacks and vehicles like a motorbike that can aid players in getting around the world faster and solve puzzles that will reward players with various resources and currency. My goodness, even traveling on your own feels so liberating. The player character can double jump and triple dash across the game, and combined with the traversal tools mentioned earlier, it's something I hope becomes standard in other MMOs. Combat feels satisfying to play. The player controls only one character, but they can switch between 3 weapons earned from either playing the game or through the gacha. We'll talk more about the gacha system in a later time, but know that some weapons can be earned in-game through quest rewards or through gambling. Switching between weapons is fast and fluid, but the best way to take advantage during combat is building up meters for your weapons. I will say, the only thing missing from the combat is when you shattered an enemy's shield, a different theme should be playing in the background, like in Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. Let me visualize it for you. This segment might sound like a critique, but hear me out on this. Tower of Fantasy is as much of an MMO as Mass Effect is an RPG. Both games have elements that do indicate that it's part of their respective genre, but don't contain enough mechanics and features to say that it fully belongs to said genre. Games like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, and Terra are classified as MMORPGs. Meanwhile, games like Destiny, Warframe, and Tom Clancy's The Division are considered MMORPG light. Tower of Fantasy falls under the latter category as it contains some of the typical MMO calling cards like a shared world, PvP element, and a repeatable endgame, but has other features and mechanics that make it a light version of the genre such as gacha, exploration, and gameplay. This appeals to me more than standard MMOs. I don't hate the genre, but I believe I've had my fill after playing Terra extensively. Tower of Fantasy is more of my pace. There's some complexity, but not to the point where it becomes overwhelming. There's more action involved in the MMO-like games than in standard MMOs. But there's enough elements to say that I'm comfortable playing Tower of Fantasy. So that's it. A good game launched to the masses. Okay, maybe there might have been a couple of technical difficulties along the way, but aside from that, there's a pretty good game beneath all of that, right? Well, that's not the whole story. Tower of Fantasy is one of those games where the more positives you encounter, an equal amount of negatives you'll find. Or in my case, more negatives than positives. I'll go into further detail about the game's visuals in the second half of the video, but what I can say right now is the visuals, from the environment to enemy NPC player design, don't match up with the overall theming. The world of Tower of Fantasy, based on the time I had with the game, is not that varied. For a majority of my playtime, I usually see a combination of rock formations, cliff sides, broken bridges, valleys, and the colors are usually shades of browns, grays, blues, and greens. In my Wuthering Waves reaction video, I commented on that game's visuals being akin to a 7th generation console game like Gears of War or Need for Speed Most Wanted. I want to make an apology to that game because at least the visual style so far is consistent to the overall theme. Tower of Fantasy, while not as muted compared to Wuthering Waves, doesn't seem to keep a consistent visual style. The music is hit or miss. Some of it is serviceable at best and forgetful at worst. So far, I haven't heard of a track that doesn't remind me of other MMOs. That's not to say that the tracks that play in the background are bad. They're just generic. I mentioned the combat for an MMO is fast and fluid, but not complex. It's not inherently a bad thing, because the last thing you want to do is alienate and confuse your player base by throwing around random mechanics and seeing what sticks. My issue is the combat isn't complex enough for the gameplay it's attempting to achieve and the systems it has. When I started summoning for characters and weapons, I noticed you don't have to equip the character with their signature weapon. In fact, players can mix and match characters and weapons at their discretion. Now that got me asking, do the characters play differently depending on the weapon that they're equipped with? This could open another layer of gameplay that could be deemed as an evolutionary take on Devil May Cry style system. My mind was filled with anticipation thinking about the possibilities. Sadly, I've come to find out that all the playable characters, including the main character, are cosmetic only and the gameplay is the same for everyone. I'm sure it's asking too much to implement a system like this, but when you have other action-based MMORPGs perform similarly to each other, it wouldn't hurt to spice up the formula a bit. The controller experience isn't anything to write home about either. In fact, half of the gaming experience with a controller on PC can be summed up to this: controller for gameplay, mouse and keyboard for everything else. Currently, there is no dedicated controller support, but the developers have stated that support will be coming in the future. But what about the story? Is it any good? How do I put it nicely? The story is boring and admittedly predictable. At the time, I'm not sure if the developers are intentionally spoiling what happens to Shirley or not. You find out what happens to her on the loading screen. Who does that? I'm not sure why, but when I view the cutscenes and attempt to pay attention to the story, it reads close to what fanfiction would sound like. Which is strange, because I can't think of what it would be fanfic of. Unless... Now that I've said what I wanted to say about Tower Fantasy on its own, how does it stack up against Genshin Impact? Is this the fabled Genshin killer that people are clamoring about? You know where the player base's heads are when they start making Genshin Impact characters in Tower of Fantasy. One of the bigger criticisms I've seen floating around is the presentation. I've made a comparison to Tower of Fantasy sweeping shot against Genshin's shot, and it goes like this. When you first play Genshin Impact, what's the first thing that you see? You basically see all of this. You see nothing but this open space. So you got foliage over here, trees over there, like building, like a city, like in the distance. It's basically just something that catches your eye. Okay, this is where I gotta go, and this is done effectively with lighting, with graphics, and basically the overall presentation. This obviously it's not original. It's in fact kind of copied from The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and that's where most of the comparisons come from. But at the very least, it looks like there's some level of effort being put behind it. There is at least something that catches your eye. The varying colors and all of this greenery. Compare that to this. It appears to be post-apocalyptic, and if that's the design decision that they went for, then more power to them. But this doesn't shout inspiring in a way that Genshin Impact does, in a way that Breath of the Wild does. It's just not. It's not something that catches the eye quickly. Seeing how Tower of Fantasy looks and plays makes me appreciate the attention to detail and level of care Hoyoverse put in their game. Make no mistake, Genshin Impact is far from perfect. Hell, I made an entire video commending and criticizing the game after a year and a half of playing, so you can't say that I'm a complete Genshin fanboy. The fact of the matter is this: Genshin's worlds are varied and distinct enough from each other to say that they're memorable. I remember the view atop Liyue's highest peak, the chilling caves of Dragonspine, the electrifying gorge of Inazuma. More often than not, there are more memorable locales I can point out in Genshin compared to Tower of Fantasy. Here's the weird thing though. Visually, it looks less like Genshin Impact and more like another game. Actually, this specific locker looks so damn familiar, but I can't figure out why. I don't want to straight up say that the developers are stealing assets from other games, but when you have objects, locales, and enemy design to look nearly identical to an existing game, sometimes it's hard to argue against the idea. The combat and exploration is more akin to Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis. The traversal system is nearly identical with dashes and multiple jumps implemented in both games. That said, the gameplay is tied to what you roll in the gacha. Yes, players can earn weapons and characters in-game, and yes, Tower of Fantasy is weirdly generous with the gacha currency, but if you want to take full advantage of the game's systems, you'll need to play with the gacha a bit. Under normal circumstances, I would be okay with this, except for one glaring issue. In Tower of Fantasy, there is a PvP mode where players can 1v1 each other. While I haven't tried out the PvP myself, because I refuse to touch any PvP modes that factor gacha luck into the gameplay, the results are about what I expected. Is the gameplay loop in Tower of Fantasy good enough to continually play ad nauseum compared to Genshin? Yes, but that's not a hard hurdle to jump over. Compared to other MMOs, that's up for debate. With that said, I had more options to play through the game with friends and randoms in Tower of Fantasy compared to Genshin Impact. I could take on domains, battle against giant monsters in the open world, and partake in the game's equivalent to strikes from Destiny. For those who are familiar with Genshin Impact's VAs, this is Fischl.
The hero defeated the demon, but the princess is never waking up. What a cruel ending.
And this is Eula.
This person was all bruised up and passed out in the mountain. Probably a lost scavenger.
Oh, and say hello to Kuki.
That was close. I didn't think the big one would follow me. I need to contact headquarters somehow. Hope there's a way out ahead.
Now, when I listened to their voices, I didn't think too much about who was behind them. But once I took the time to do research for this video, I'm shocked by how low quality it felt compared to their prior roles. Even outside of Genshin, these VAs have done exceptional work in other games and anime. So, what happened here? Well, this is what happens when a voice actor doesn't have a good voice director. It's funny that I mentioned Fischl's VA, Brittany Cox, because I want to use Cox's role in Genshin and compare it to her character in Tower of Fantasy, Samir. Also, thanks to the recent summer events, we can compare and contrast between Fischl and Samir properly.
Thou wert blessed with the coveted opportunity to enter the palace of the Immanok Reich and meet with the Kaiser and Kaiserin der Verurteilung. Or hast thou conveniently forgotten this magnificent occasion?
I looked for her for years. I saw her face, and I thought I had an answer. But that wasn't even her. They wear my friend's face as if it was rightfully theirs to start with. I am your fear, your dark side. I am the nightmare from which you have never escaped in all these years. Standing before me, you are nothing! When there's cheese, the mouse will walk into the trap. And I see you're trapped. How do you like that? Don't worry, if you can remove the timer, you can get out of this alive. But if you fail, well, at least you'll die together.
The same voice actress, but different types of deliveries. One sounds like she's giving her all, while the other sounds like any other role. It's kind of a running theme for a game like Tower of Fantasy based on from what I played so far. Everything feels like it's a half step from what it's supposed to be. The PC port exists, but there are a few oddities. There's controller support, but for only half of the experience. The world is there, but it feels lacking. The voice acting is there, but only a step down compared to their prior work.
New samples!
New samples! What is that delivery? Half the game feels like a solid foundation for an awesome game, but the other feels half-baked at best and fundamentally lacking at worst. So what? Do I hate the game? Yesn't. I've been around gaming culture long enough to remember a time where Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was considered the Halo killer, and they're not the only ones. Many have attempted to dethrone Halo, but compared to all these other games that came and went, Modern Warfare, along with all the other COD games after it, stood the test of time. Seeing this debate between Tower of Fantasy and Genshin Impact brings back memories of these discussions. These two games have about as much in common with each other like Call of Duty and Battlefield do. One offers an experience the other doesn't, and vice versa. If you're looking for a single player experience with basic multiplayer features, then Genshin Impact is your game. If you're looking for a game that's kind of like Genshin Impact, but with more multiplayer features like raids, guilds, PvP stuff, etc., then try to give Tower of Fantasy a try, because I'll be damned, this is a good framework for a game. The combat is good enough, the exploration and level of movement is good, and the gameplay loop is engaging. But that's my underlying issue with Tower of Fantasy. Everything is good, just nothing special. The story is forgettable, the presentation feels lacking, and the UI can get confusing. But that's the beauty of games like this. There's room for improvement. We're only talking about this game a few weeks into its lifespan. The developers have promised that more content and improvements are coming in the future. I don't see myself playing this game for far longer than I am right now, but I can say that I don't regret giving Tower of Fantasy a try. It may not be my go-to game, but it's certainly someone else's. Beneath all of that jank, there is a good game. It's up to the developers whether or not they want to polish it up and have Tower of Fantasy be bigger and better than how it launched. Considering how negatively it was received in China and how bad the reputation was in other games, I find it hard to be optimistic. I want to remain hopeful, however. If Tower of Fantasy got someone like me to check it out, it's doing something right. Try the game out yourself, and see if it's right for you.